Okay, my name is Mary K MacLeod. I'm a senior scholar at the university, and I'm also a good friend of the three gentlemen here. And the three gentlemen and myself have known Father Greg for years. So tonight's going to be a special night because each of them are going to talk about a specific topic regarding Father Greg, his contribution to Cape Breton society, and perhaps to our own personal lives. So the first speaker tonight is Father Dan Doucet. Father Dan is a great friend, as I said, of Father Greg, and he is going to speak on Greg's faith that moved him through the years, that helped in his evolution of the economic system that made so many contributions to Cape Breton society and Cape Breton culture. So Father Dan, you're up now.
Thank you, Mary Kay. You can all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I feel like I might be opening for Ashley McIsaac and Dougie McPhee. There's some heavyweights following me. Anyway, Ashley and Dougie, good to be here with you. I'll begin by quoting myself. I thought that might make me feel a little important. In my book recently published called Father Greg, I said in the introduction, quote, "This book is not about community economic development. Others are far more qualified to write about this subject than I, and are indeed doing it." Well, here this evening, here they are, Harvey and Tom. I feel honored to be on this stage with them. They are indeed among our local giants on the subject of Greg MacLeod and on the subject of community economic development. I see a number of students here. I'm glad to see students here. I welcome you all, CBU students. And I would like to suggest to you, the students here, that you are most fortunate in having Tom and Harvey as resource people for you at CBU. You will find none better anywhere in North America. So make use of them while you can, while you're here. They're tremendous resources. I've no intention of adding anything to what they have to say to you on Greg's economic vision. I'll stick to talking about the person, Greg MacLeod, which in a way is as difficult as the topic of his economic vision, because Greg was and continues to be hard to pin down. And I'll stick to one aspect of Greg, which I feel is relevant to the topic being discussed this evening. I'll attempt in a small way to debunk the notion that Greg was neither fish nor fowl, and to demonstrate that he was both fish and fowl, and a number of other things as well. And that his faith, an inclusive faith, was what drove both fish and fowl, and that drove his economic vision. The fish or fowl problem has to do with institutions, whether it was the institutional church, the institutional university, the conventional business world, or the conventional political world. None of these constituencies wanted to claim Greg as one of their own. He was always fish to their fowl, or fowl to their fish. The church was nervous about him from the beginning. He was too secular. He did not wear a Roman collar. He dressed outrageously when he came back from Europe in 1969. I remember him wearing these flowered ascots around his neck and a monocle, like kind of an English toff sort of thing. Some of you may remember this. He would not take all the small rules of the church seriously. He expected bishops to be intelligent, and he never asked permission to speak publicly. The university had problems with him as well. He did not publish, at least not abstract articles. He did not do pure research. His research was always applied to the community. He expected university presidents to be intelligent, and he did not ask permission from them to speak publicly. The business world saw him as an impractical, visionary priest with no understanding of the real world. Politicians saw him as a meddlesome priest. They would have liked to do to him what King Henry II did with Thomas à Becket. Some of you who have studied history may remember in the 12th century, King Henry II had as his second in command the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas à Becket, and they ran afoul of one another. They didn't get along very well, and at some point the king sort of murmured, will nobody rid me of this meddlesome priest? And somebody in his entourage took him literally, and they went and assassinated poor Becket in his own cathedral. So some politicians would have liked to do that to Greg, except it wasn't allowed. There were exceptions, of course. In the church world, Archbishop Hayes, the liberated Bishop of Halifax. In the business world, he worked closely with some of Cape Breton's top businessmen, such as John Eiking, Jim Keogh, and Newman Dubinsky. It may be noted that these three, among others, also came themselves from a strong faith background. And he did work with certain individuals in the political world, but they were exceptions. You get the drift. On the other hand, there were at least two constituencies where he could be fish or fowl, or both fish and fowl. One such constituency was the media. The media are always interested in individuals who can analyze and articulate well, and who can point to possibilities on issues of interest in the community. Both the Cape Breton Post and the local CBC always had the welcome mat out for him. The other constituency, which recognized Greg as both fish and fowl, was the general populace of Cape Breton. If the official church did not trust him, the lay people did. The name Father Greg stuck to him like fleas to a dog. And while he never waved his own flag, thousands of people waved it for him. Only a couple of years ago, I visited an old cousin at the radar base, the housing project run by New Dawn Enterprises. She pointed out the window and said, "Father Greg is putting up a new building right over there." I did not tell her that Father Greg had not been with New Dawn for at least 20 or 25 years. He had long moved on. But whether it was New Dawn, the craft school, the rope factory, or the Red Row, people could immediately identify businesses with Father Greg with both approval and affection. And so the general populace did not demand, like the institutions did, that Greg be either priest or businessman, activist or academic. He could be any of these. From Greg's point of view, it had never been an issue. Both fish and fowl were children of a worldview that was formed by his faith background. Greg grew up in Sydney Mines in a world of faith that included the economic. And he left Sydney Mines to broaden and deepen that faith. At the same time, deepening his embrace of the economic as he came to understanding it in the development of people. He grew up in that era in which the cooperative movement had reached its height under the leadership of Jimmy Tompkins and Moses Cody. It filled the lungs of the Catholic Church of the time. But interestingly enough, in the town of Sydney Mines, where Greg grew up, it was the Presbyterian Church which gave expression to the cooperative movement in the form of the British Canadian Cooperative, which at the time was one of the most successful cooperatives in North America. While he would not realize it at the time, it would become obvious to him later on that different churches and different religions had come to the same awareness of the need to put the economic at the service of people. And as a young priest, his first assignment was with Father Michael Gillis in Stellarton, who, along with being one of the founders of the cooperative movement in the area, was both a critical thinker and a congenial person. From there, he went to study in Europe, where while sharpening his reasoning powers by the study of philosophy, he came in contact with two different groups of students who manifested the gospel imperative of social justice in different ways. There were the students from Quebec, who were by this time abandoning the church and moving their energies into political activity and social democracy, but who were still driven by the heritage of the Caisse Populaire movement, which was the child of the church in Quebec. The other group of students in Europe that influenced Greg were the students from Latin America, all steeped in liberation theology, that saw the early Christian church as a model for present-day economics and the prophets of the Old Testament as models of spokesmen for social justice. Liberation theology would later take a hit under two popes, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, who tended to confuse it with communism. But it is experiencing a revival today, at least in some form, with Pope Francis, and we've witnessed it just very recently surfacing in the discussions of the Synod of the Amazon. On the conclusion of his 5 years of study in Europe, Greg would take a 6-week tour of Latin America before returning to Cape Breton. He visited 6 countries, studying how liberation theology was being applied in different ways in each of these countries. Along with this, in his studies of Thomas Aquinas and his social doctrine in Europe, he learned to make connections between the Christian Aquinas and the Jewish scholar Maimonides, as well as the Islamic Averroes of the Middle Ages. And while those of us who had the good fortune to travel to Europe stood in awe of medieval cathedrals, Greg was looking deeply into the monastic system. He concluded that St. Benedict, the founder of Western monasticism in the 6th century, had in the monastic system formed the first corporation in the Western world. He would look at the Benedictine monastery and the Hudson's Bay Company here in Canada as two different models of corporate structure. Also, while in Europe, he traveled to communist-controlled Poland and Czechoslovakia to test his Christian theories against their Marxist theories. All this he brought back to Cape Breton in 1969. He had been assigned to teach at Xavier College, and he would make it his life's work. Totally involved in the movement of independence for Xavier College, as soon as it became independent as UCCB, University College of Cape Breton, he started creating pockets within it that, while not being independent, would have greater flexibility than the larger university structure. The Brodeur Institute, the Tompkins Institute, the Abraham Institute, all having to do with the humanities, with a moral compass, with the community, and all using the best of science and technology to achieve their goals. He is not overly religious here, but the same moral compass is driving him. As he sought to make the religious communities more moral, more reflective of their purposes, so he sought to make the intellectual community more moral, more reflective of its purpose. Obviously, if he were starting off his career now, he would do things differently. The challenges are different. But I think he would start from the same premise, that institutions are necessary, including religious ones, academic ones, and business ones. But they are not ends in themselves and are in constant need of renewal. That technology must always be put at the service of humanity, and that a moral compass is very important in both building and renewing. Moreover, the building and renewing is best accomplished to the sound of the fiddle and a glass of good red wine. Whatever you're doing, you have to have a good time while you're doing it. It can never be grunge work. It has to be something that you're enjoying, that comes from the heart, that comes from the soul. Cape Breton still has the necessary ingredients. I think we need to call forth from among ourselves new leadership, strong leadership. We need to support this leadership. We need to give it direction. We need to support our institutions and critique them at the same time. And we need to do it at the same time as we are fiddling and praying. We need to think in terms of both fish and fowl. And I think we can all learn from Greg's vision as we move ourselves forward to the next chapter. And you'll hear more about that from our two next speakers here.
Dan very modestly sort of started his presentation, but really I'm sandwiched between giants. Our moderator, Mary Kay, her body of work, Dan's body of work, including his book released in August, which I highly, highly recommend. Again, he's very modest at the outset, saying it's about the person Greg, but really he has made cogent and coherent the body of work of Greg. And Harvey's book, which will be coming out on December the 4th, also wholeheartedly endorsed. So thank you for the privilege of being among you. I really first came to start working with Greg in 2004. I was new to CBU at that time, still in its last days as UCCB, and Greg invited me to a meeting at 37 Esplanade. And I remember the meeting more for the visuals than for the specific injunctions and instructions, and there certainly were instructions. Greg was deputizing me, but he was leaping off his chair. He was still burning with ideas. That K MacLeod spark was there. It wasn't dwelling on the accomplishments of already many, many years of work, but still looking to the gaps, looking forward, looking at what yet had to be done. And there was a lot more done thanks to Greg after 2004. But I'm going to say this evening that Greg's work is unfinished. He knew it was unfinished, and he hoped to bequeath some of that work to us. Greg, longtime professor, founder of multiple community corporations and organizations, he took up the mantle of priest professors like Moses Cody and Jimmy Tompkins, and he envisioned Cape Bretoners as a self-sufficient, liberated people doing dignified work. Our island, our whole island, was Greg's laboratory, but his contacts and his comparisons and his seeds were global. What emerges from my contacts with Greg, and by still constantly learning new things about him, is not just his fertile mind and his reluctance to sit still. It's also this. He was really a champion of Cape Breton self-government. Cape Breton self-government. And by self-government, I'm not talking about separation. I'm not alluding to jokes about the Cape Breton Liberation Army or somehow tearing up the causeway. I'm talking about an ecosystem of local initiatives, a decentralized way of being, decentralized. I am talking about governance as much as government. I'm talking about control by Capers of our own businesses, organizations, and institutions for the sake of our collective wealth and dignity. That's why, for example, Greg envisioned New Dawn Enterprises doing not just one thing, but many things. That's why he created outfits like BCA. That's why he insisted that we need our own full-fledged university and community college, despite relentless opposition by many prominent mainlanders, and there was relentless opposition. That's why he insisted that the Coast Guard College be here, that the provincial courts be decentralized, that the railway be maintained, that there be an Unamagi College, that we have proper hospice facilities. That's why much of his work involved cultivating partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Cape Bretoners and encouraging pride of cultures and languages and homegrown learning and action research. That's why Greg pushed churches, somewhat unsuccessfully, to leverage their investments to spark community development and empower new generations of leaders. I know that Greg would be appalled by recent moves by the province of Nova Scotia to eliminate local and regional health authorities, to eliminate school boards, chunks of the necessary ecosystems for Cape Breton self-government. Greg's work, despite his great efforts and thoughtful philosophy, is still largely a series of discrete, albeit laudable projects. Greg's body of work hasn't yet coalesced as a movement to change Cape Breton society, to make us, in Moses Cody's famous formulation, masters of our own destiny. That movement, that bringing together of Greg's exceptional work and philosophy requires, I think, two elements. The first one I will call, maybe somewhat awkwardly, a Cape Breton national project. A Cape Breton national project. And the second I will call a solidarity strategy. Solidarity strategy. A Scottish political science colleague once asked me, do Cape Bretoners consider themselves a nation in the sense that many Newfoundlanders, Quebecers, or Acadians consider themselves a nation? I replied, we could. Again, a Cape Breton national project is not some kind of separation. It's not CB exit. It's a noble idea of islanders, indigenous, settlers, recent newcomers, sharing a collective patriotism, including symbols, democratic leaders, our own institutions, and collective investments to reinforce that patriotism. If we embraced a Cape Breton national project, if we put a label on it, if we had a sense of the island as a national community, then every development by us, every community project, every legacy of Greg, every homegrown institution, every piece of infrastructure designed by us, every new council or assembly chosen by Cape Bretoners becomes not a fight in itself, not an offshoot or someone's project, but a step on the way to building up the island. Greg worked with thousands of people, not just prominent business people and politicians. He had time for a lot of people. He mentored many international students. He was generous with his time in guiding some of my students. He was democratic. He was encouraging. But most of his projects are still owned by small groups. The wins are wins for those groups. And I think that's where the solidarity strategy comes in. A sense of ownership and mutual aid by the broader Cape Breton society. Grameen Bank, started by Mohammed Yunus, whom Greg very much admired, is actually owned by hundreds of thousands of low-income shareholders. It's like a tree trunk that unites so many offshoots and projects. The solidarity movement in Poland was much more than elite opposition to communism. It was an entire parallel society where people set up their own grassroots institutions, whether they had permission or not. And as we know, Greg was a master of asking for forgiveness rather than permission. Membertou First Nation came to prosper under a social entrepreneurship model that involved sparking civil society and collective decision-making and collective ownership. Just do it and let the creaky or antiquated or even oppressive structures catch up to us and come to us with their requests. The national project and the solidarity strategy, building on Greg's work. But for this to work in the long run, I think I need to temper some of my exuberance and temper some of Greg's contagious, action-oriented optimism for just a moment. Just a moment. See, what Greg was often doing was trying to get around, understandably trying to get around ailing institutions. They seem intractable. Fine, I won't let them sap my spirit, he would say. I'll go around. I'll start something new. I won't allow myself to be infected by negative energy. But those ailing but powerful institutions are not always passive boulders on the landscape. Those boulders can start moving and roll over us. Think about how edicts for municipal restructuring essentially eliminated local government in many communities. When Glace Bay, once the largest town in Canada, doesn't even have a resident councillor except one living just on the boundary. When Louisbourg has to wait for politicians and police who don't live there to decide whether they can ever hold another parade. You have seriously undermined the ecosystem the self-governing ecosystem that Greg and people inspired by him were cultivating, that's because there's no sense of self-government. Someone else decides for us. The bosses, the man, they are elsewhere. Alexis de Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill were convinced that local government was essential to any national project, to any solidarity strategy. And I believe they were right. Greg saw the danger in Cape Breton communities losing control over, for example, our credit unions. Essentially, we have also been losing control over any levers of government. In our context, another institution that cannot be ignored is one that Greg was part of, the Catholic Church. Dan writes eloquently about the motions, the resolutions that Greg would bring to priests' deanery meetings and other assemblies. He would urge church reform and engagement and better management and transparency. The motions might pass, but they were dutifully ignored. I know from my own conversations with Greg that this frustrated him. Greg didn't let it sap his spirit, of course. He worked outside the formal structures. But those structures have deeply wounded the morale and development of our people. When the persistent cover-ups of sexual abuse of children finally blew into the open, when the former bishop was arrested and jailed, the church leadership, headquartered off-island, took parish assets but undertook no meaningful reforms. Responsible ministry protocols, yes, but no structural reforms. Still no synods of parish representatives, not much financial transparency, no role for parishes in vetting candidates for priest or bishop. Father still knows best. Any political scientist will tell you that this is a continuing recipe for the abuse of power. The churches can still be key players, though, in the ideal of masters of our own destiny, in the renewal of our island. But the setbacks have been serious. My point is that sometimes you do have to push against rotten structures rather than simply veer around them, because those structures can gravely harm our communities. Greg's work and writings and sayings will influence reformers and community developers around the world. Will they engender a movement here? Maybe Cape Breton as a whole actually lacks the acute, immediate sense of crisis for a movement to be masters of our own destiny, for a national project, for a solidarity strategy. I believe, however, that visionary leadership, the Greg MacLeod type of leadership, is a more likely necessary piece. It may still be a missing piece. A leadership that inclusively mobilizes fellow citizens and compassionately points to an attainable promised land. I hope that somehow we can spark that. There's a Polish proverb that says, "Myśl długo, czyń prędko." Essentially, think carefully and long, but then don't drag your feet. I think Greg did that during his remarkable career and vocation. As such, he gave us not just a glimpse of the promised land, but many of the methods to journey there. And that's why I remain hopeful. Thank you, Greg. Thank you all.
I did know Greg for a long time. I first met him when I was a young philosophy student. Greg was renovating a building on Townsend Street called the old Wolfson Building, if any of you remember that. And I needed a job for the summer, and he gave me one. And I was most grateful. And there are many hundreds and perhaps thousands of people who are also grateful to Greg for the jobs that he provided for them. When Greg returned to Cape Breton, he saw what we now describe as a depleted community. That is, it was a community that was weakening in terms of its industrial pillars. Coal and steel were both weakening, and then eventually the fishery as well. But Greg saw, in addition to that, a very, very strong social fabric, a kind of a glue that held the society together. and it made this area resilient. And I think that's true about Cape Breton. I think it is resilient. It's seen some tough times, and it's managed to navigate its way through them. So for Greg, there were certainly influences like Tom and Dan have mentioned, like Cody and Tompkins, and a priest in the Basque region whose name is quite a challenge to pronounce. His name is Jose Maria Arizmendiariata. And all of these individuals worked in different contexts than the one Greg found himself in, but they all managed to focus on local issues. And that's what Greg decided to do. Greg was very focused throughout his life, and it's one of the reasons he had such a strong or significant impact, because he kept working away at that one thing, which was to provide local employment. Well, how do you do that? How do you go about providing local employment? Well, for Greg, the only answer was we have to create jobs by creating businesses. So throughout his career, Greg created many businesses. And in doing that work, I think he became an entrepreneur. He took on the trappings of an entrepreneur. And I use that word entrepreneur narrowly, not in the broad sense that many people use it. If you start a business, you're an entrepreneur. That's a broad definition. But if you define entrepreneur narrowly, an entrepreneur has to be an innovator. And Greg qualifies for that narrow definition. He was an innovator. He created things that were not available before him. And as a result of that, he was able to, in a sense, undertake projects that were being abandoned by conventional business people. He was doing things that would otherwise not be done. That's a definition of being an innovator, if you can do things that otherwise would not be done. Greg shared with those individuals, Arizmendiariata, Cody, and Tompkins, an idea of Christian social action. And in that, basically, the first premise is that at times our actions can leave the world in a better state of affairs than we found it. And the second part of this is, and when you have the capacity to act in these ways, you have a moral obligation to do so. It's a moral imperative. And the greater your capacity to act in these ways, the greater your responsibility. So that was, in a nutshell, the kind of thinking, I think, that launched Greg on his career. I have to do something. If you look at some of the videotape we have of him here, and we're blessed to have videotape to capture Greg, he will say things like, I am my brother's keeper, and I have to do what I can to create something here that will help people remain in this place. So Greg was locally focused, and the way that we've come to describe this in terms of the academics who are looking at Greg's work is that we say Greg was a place-based entrepreneur. We don't use terms like social entrepreneur, we don't use terms like community development. Not that those terms are abandoned or unworthy, but we want to focus on the thing that Greg focused on, which was the local area and what he could do here, the place where he lived. So during Greg's efforts to create jobs in this way, he undertook to establish new kinds of businesses. In Greg's mind, you weren't going to get very far unless you had cooperation between three basic institutions: government, university, and business. And he called that trio a triple helix. And the idea was, when those institutions worked together, they could create something, they could make a difference. And so Greg undertook to establish activities that would involve all three components: the university, the government, and business. With Greg, this took the form of companies like New Dawn Enterprises, which is organized in a very unusual way. Many people in Cape Breton think that New Dawn Enterprises generates wealth for shareholders. But New Dawn, in fact, doesn't have any shareholders. The structure does not contain a part on the balance sheet that says shareholder. All it has are assets and liabilities, no shareholders. And so the model that is very likely to be attributed to, say, the Chicago School of Milton Friedman and company, that businesses are in it for maximization of profit in order to maximize the profits of the shareholders. That doesn't work when you look at a structure like New Dawn, which is exactly what Greg wanted to create, something that was not a conventional system. He did things as well with another company called BCA Holdings, which relied on a unique set of business models, not structure. It, like New Dawn, is structured as a company limited by guarantee. Very odd to think I have created a venture capital company that is a not-for-profit company. Seems very discouraging to investors to say, well, look, I want you to invest in my not-for-profit company. It's a venture capital company. But the purpose of this, again, was to create possibilities where none appeared to exist, where conventional assessment said, there's nothing that can be done here, we have to pass over and move on. In those cases, Greg would say, no, let me take a look at it and see what I can do. And the list of companies is amazing. There are rope manufacturing companies, food processing companies, a fish processing company, a radio station, a hardwood floor manufacturing company, a ventilation manufacturing company, and several commercial centers, as well as a 44-unit condominium. These are all projects that Greg led or created. And if you look at them, it doesn't make sense to put them together unless you focus on the local area. And then suddenly the rational decision is revealed to you, the reasoning behind his approach to things. So Greg worked very hard inside this university to push the boundaries of what people meant by research. He didn't do, as Dan mentioned, he didn't publish a lot of journal articles. He didn't write a lot of books, although he wrote a few, and the ones he wrote were very successful. But mostly what he did was put his energy into struggling inside the local economy to create jobs for people in this area. And he wanted the university to recognize that that was a legitimate sort of research. And he had quite a struggle to get anybody to believe that that, in fact, should be the case. Most people would find that just too unconventional, and that the sorts of things he was doing were not really research at all. But indeed they were. And what it is that Greg was exploring boundaries. Much of our situation here has been determined by people sitting on boards in distant cities, playing in industries that are very large, international, global industries. And in those circumstances, we have very little influence. And over time, as technology changes, the circumstances that we face become more and more precarious. So Greg was interested in exploring the connection between technological change and human values. In that sense, it's a very broad brush that Greg was painting with. I think in many ways, Greg is an exceptional person, and every generation produces exceptional people of various stripes. And we need to ask ourselves, what do we learn from these exceptional people? And I think we can ask ourselves, do we do a good job of learning what it is that they have to teach us? And really, I believe the answer to that is sometimes we don't. We don't do a very good job. And what we do instead is we look at the achievements of the person and we say, isn't that marvelous? And we think how special that person was. And then we might cap this stream of thought off with something like, we're not likely to see his kind again, right? So we tend to sort of put them as very exceptional, and they're just not, there's nothing we can do about it. It's just we were lucky enough to be interacting with them. Now they're gone, too bad. But that's us. That's not Greg. That's us. That's the way we are perceiving things. So I think we need to ask ourselves again, why was someone like Greg special? Why was it that he was able to do so many things that had such welcome results for this community? And when we do that, we're looking to try to unearth the techniques that he developed. And that's in fact what Greg did. Over the years that he worked here, he developed a series of techniques, approaches that he would take to tackle problems. Sometimes he would need to mobilize public opinion. And when he did that, he was really good at that. He would mobilize the churches. That was one of the first places he would go. And he would take the moral authority that the people from those church communities provided, and with that he could express a public dissatisfaction with a certain situation. And from there, he could go on to do something else. A classic example of this is the rope company in North Sydney, where a group of ladies occupied the picket line, and they were chosen to do that because it was felt there would be less chance of violence if they were the people on the picket line. But people who were just unaccustomed to doing those sorts of things were convinced that it was worthwhile standing up, and they had an enormous effect in terms of the moral authority they gave to Greg so that he could go ahead and hold on to that rope plant, which still operates today and provides very good jobs for quite a large number of people. So Greg was socially active. He knew when to resort to that, and he knew how to do that. So I think we, as a group of people who were lucky enough to spend our time when Greg was around, have to ask ourselves, what else can he teach us? What can we learn from him? What were the techniques that he developed and implemented? And can we take those techniques, look at our situation today, and perhaps imitate the sorts of things that Greg would have likely done if he were still around today? So Greg's philosophy was that we have to take action. We have to take action because we have the possibility of making things better than they are now. And when we do these things, we have to break down barriers that are perhaps invisible, but they're there and they're real, and they keep things from happening in our favor or going in our favor. And Greg was able to combine both that ability to be a social activist with the ability to be quite a good entrepreneur, and in the sense that he was an innovative business person. Greg was always supported by a cast, by the way, of business people who gave him advice. And every now and then when Greg would get into a fight that he couldn't win, they'd pull him back out of the alley and say, look, Greg, it's time for you to do something else. And he would listen because he had a lot of respect for those people. So these are some of the things I think that display or give us an idea of what Greg's philosophy was and how he lived his philosophy. In 20th century philosophy, a very famous philosopher was Wittgenstein. He used to talk about philosophy as an activity. Well, Greg certainly did his philosophy in the form of action. He lived it. And I think we can do well to go back and look at him again and see what else we can learn.